Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 12th B.G. Deshmukh Endowment lecture on the title India's Geopolitics, What Should Be Done to Strengthen It by Professor Bharat Karnad. I request everyone to mute your audio, of course we have done, and stop your video for better connectivity. Over to you, Menon.
Good evening. As chairperson of the Endowment Lectures Committee of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I have the privilege of welcoming you this evening to the 12th B.G. Deshmukh Endowment Lecture. We are indeed honored to have two eminent scholars with us today. Professor Bharat Karnad, Emeritus Professor in National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research in Delhi, will deliver a lecture on India's geopolitics, what should be done to strengthen it. We are grateful to Professor Karnad and thank him for acceding to our request. We are equally indebted to Mr. Shivshankar Menon, former National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary, currently visiting Professor Ashoka University, for doing us the honor of presiding at this lecture and making remarks at the end. We look forward to a fascinating conversation about a timely topic of geopolitics and India's role in the emerging new world order. I thank the two distinguished personalities for being here today. Before I hand over the mic to you, sir, kindly allow me to tell the audience about this endowment and also to introduce the speakers. So Mr. B.G. Deshmukh was the president of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai from 2001 to 2007. He was a man of vision. He had a deep sense of commitment and worked tirelessly to promote this heritage institution. He has left an indelible impression on many educational, cultural, and social institutions, not only in Maharashtra, but the entire country. Mr. Deshmukh was born in Pune in 1929. He had a brilliant academic career and joined the IAS in 1951. He stood first in the first batch of IAS officers in independent India and ended up as cabinet secretary in the government of India. On his retirement, he returned to Mumbai and was invited to join the House of Tatas as a senior director, where he looked after their interests in the social sector. He was also chairman of the CSMBS Museum in Mumbai and president of the Bombay Natural History Society, among many others. In 2001, he became president of the Asiatic Society and led and steered the bicentennial celebrations that took place 2 years later. Conferences, seminars, lectures, cultural events, and the outreach programs of Asiatica enhanced the prestige of the society. Mr. Deshmukh in his last days had immersed himself in rural development activities. He felt that social upliftment of the underprivileged could improve the lot of the rural poor. He toured the state extensively, identified problems, and found solutions. May I end by citing something he has said, which is relevant both for the Asiatic Society as well as other bodies and corporates. I have tremendous faith in the young men and women of India. What they need is direction for right action. I just provide that and nothing more. So Mr. Deshmukh's mantra for every institution was good governance. It was his firm belief that good governance alone would lead to the growth and development of any institution, and this is precisely what he provided to all under his leadership. In order to remind us of the importance of governance, he made a generous donation to the Asiatic Society so that we could hold an annual lecture, seminar, or workshop on the subject of governance. Mr. B.G. Deshmukh's memory continues to inspire us to this day. Professor Bharat Karnad is Distinguished Fellow at the United Service Institution of India and Emeritus Professor at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He is the author of numerous books, among them, Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition 2018, Why India is Not a Great Power Yet 2015, and Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security, now in the second edition, 2005-2002. He has a BA and MA from the University of California at Santa Barbara and at Los Angeles, respectively. Member of the first National Security Advisory Board and of the Nuclear Doctrine Drafting Group, National Security Council, and previously advisor, Defense Expenditure, 10th Finance Commission, India. He has been visiting scholar at Princeton University, University of Pennsylvania, USA, Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, and the Henry L. Stimson Center, Washington, DC, and has lectured at the top military training institutes. Thank you, Professor Karnad, for being with us today. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon is currently visiting professor at Ashoka University, India, and chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies. He was previously National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India from January 2010 to May 2014, Foreign Secretary of India, October 2006 to July 2009, and has served as the Indian Ambassador or High Commissioner to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. In 2016, he published Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. His book on India and Asian Geopolitics, The Past, Present, published by Brookings Press USA and Penguin Random House India, was released in April 2021. He has been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, and Richard Bellum Fellow at MIT in 2015. He was chosen one of the top 100 global leaders by thinkers, 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. He's also chairman, advisory board, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, distinguished fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, India, distinguished visiting research fellow at the National University of Singapore, member, Board of Trustees, International Crisis Group, and a distinguished fellow, Asia Society Policy Institute, New York. Thank you, sir, for so graciously accepting our invitation. I now hand over the proceedings to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Kirsager. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here for Bharat Karnad's lecture, which is what we are all really here for. Bharat, as we all know, is India's supreme realist. I don't think it was a very small tribe when he began. And thanks to his effort, I think there are more realists, not enough, but there are many more today in India. And his contributions really to strategic thinking in India are legion, to the development of the nuclear doctrine, to professional military education and throughout the country. And he speaks at various military and other institutions. And most of all, he displays a scholar's integrity. I think this becomes clear from the respect with which he is listened to across the political spectrum and in all the professional academies and organizations that I know of which deal with Indian national security. His interventions at pivotal times, he was a member of the first National Security Advisory Board when they were drafting the nuclear doctrine, was a member of the drafting group, made huge contributions. At various times, he has really shifted the needle on Indians' national security, even though governments are very reluctant, I think, to give credit to scholars outside government. But I think there are several instances. But anyway, I don't want to go on and on about Professor Karnad. Let me request him to make his remarks. He will speak on India's geopolitics and what should be done to improve it. And thereafter, I'll say a few words. I'll make a few comments, but we would then request questions from all of you here, either in the chat box or by raising your hand, and we will then give you the floor. But over to you, Bharat. Can't wait to hear you.
Thank you very much, Shankar. And thank you awfully much for your very kind and generous words. I think Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky in Ukraine perhaps heard of the importance of the Asiatic Society Mumbai to have staged the crisis out in Eastern Europe, because it perfectly contextualizes the topic we're going to sort of alight on and try and deliberate on. The thing I think is, as everybody is aware, geography is a constant. It's the fundamental basis of foreign policy of most countries. There are, of course, countries that opt out, like Switzerland, who don't want to be part of anything. That's fair enough. And they are, in fact, out of the reckoning, as it were. But that said, I think in one sense, India is blessed. It has a very ancient statecraft that perhaps was amongst the first civilizational entities in that sense, as a living organism, a statecraft as a living organism, that talked about, had a very geographic sense of its international relations approach. In the Arthashastra, but then again, Arthashastra was merely a codicil, a codification of wisdom that had been distilled over the ages until Chanakya or Kautilya put it down on paper, as it were. But the statecraft that I'm talking about, the geopolitical design I'm talking about, was the mandala system that was first envisaged in the Vedas. So you really go back to a civilizational source for our thinking. It was very good for its time. The mandala system basically conceived of concentric tiers of countries around India. So the first tier of countries outside of Bharatvarsh, as it was then called in the Vedas, were invariably deemed to be adversarial. The next tier of countries that joined the adversary countries were deemed friendly, etc. So you had concentric circles of friendly and adversarial states. There was a certain geometric determinism in this, and therefore perhaps its utility is limited in the present age, where you have friendships across the world, and it was a very small world at the time this was conceived, the mandala system was conceived, and may not be as appropriate perhaps in applying those concepts in the modern world. But still, the point to make is that we have this background of thinking in a geopolitical way. In the more modern world, there are really two schools of geopolitics. The first one was actually enunciated by Alfred Thayer Mahan, who, in looking and analyzing the success of Great Britain, wondered how it was that a small little island, off the Atlantic coast, could literally rule the world. And he came to the very obvious conclusion that because the Royal Navy dominated the seas, they dominated the approaches to the littoral, and therefore controlled the trade and the commerce, and therefore were the overlords, as it were, of the international system as it evolved. In 1910 or thereabouts, a geographer and statesman, Sir Halford Mackinder, posited a more land-based view of politics, international politics, power politics. And he said that a country, and here I'd like the audience to apply their minds and think of the world map. Now, bring forward in your minds the world map. And what you see is the Eurasian continent that is joined by the Suez Isthmus to Africa, which together then with Eurasia and Africa constitute, in Halford Mackinder's words, the world island. Now, his analysis, basically his theorizing in geopolitical terms was this. He said that any country, any power that dominates Eurasia, which he called the heartland, dominates the world island. Any power that rules the world island, that is Eurasia and Africa, rules the world. In simplistic terms, that this was his conception of world power. Of course, Alfred Mackinder represented the British interests, and you can see why at the peak of Britain's global power, he could conceive of this notion of the heartland power, etc. And the thing was that here, the heartland power he talked about, and it's very central to the Ukrainian crisis that we now have on our hands, when he said that the power that controls Eastern Europe controls the Eurasian heartland. Of course, in 1910, there was no China to contend with. And therefore he thought about the Central European power, such as Germany, in a sense, acquiring so much power as to control all of Europe with its pivot on Eastern Europe. And so you have this idea of, the heartland power, Eurasian heartland power controlling the world island, etc. This is essentially a land-based notion of world power, which goes up against the Alfred Thayer Mahanian notion of sea power. Now, in the 1940s, and this is just to place the geopolitics of the modern era, in the 1940s, geopolitical strategist from Yale University, in fact, Nicholas Spykman, it is spelled Spykman, S-P-Y-K-M-A-N, but pronounced Spykman, conceived of the rimland. And his thing is perfectly appropriate and relevant to India's concern, because India constitutes a major rimland in Asia. And his view was, and this was just post Second World War, he said that a rimland power that is able to mobilize the resources of the Asian littoral can begin to control the heartland power. In a sense, because he foresaw the end of the British Empire and the reduction in the role of the Royal Navy, etc. And he said that the littoral power, therefore, the rimland power, would be able to, in a sense, take over the role that the British had theretofore played. Now, this is where India comes in. India, as the rimland power, was the India of pre-1947. When Spykman conceived of India as ranging geographically all the way from the border of Persia to Burma. And he said that this is the power that can then be a counterweight to, be a counterpoise to the Asian heartland power. He thought of it in unitary terms, the Asian heartland power. What we have right now in the new millennium, the 21st century, is the nexus, the evolving nexus between China and Russia, which then really brings to bear, it bears on the notion of the Eurasian power in a very real sense. Because with Russia and China now getting together, you have their interests, in a sense, converging to face the world. This is now seen in Ukraine, for instance, where the rimland power, Asia, is sort of traipsing on the margins, trying desperately hard to remain on the fence, trying not to alienate Russia, because it's a very friendly power, and one of the central pillars of the Eurasian land power. And you have China, which is a complete adversary, the prime adversary. So you do not want to upset Russia or alienate it, lest we lose the leverage we have via our friendship with Russia to use against China. But nor do we want to, completely upset the Atlantic Alliance, the maritime powers led by the United States and the West European countries under NATO, which would mean, in a sense, restricting our avenues of success. Now, why is this sort of a geopolitical concept, in some sense, limiting if we consider India's options as we have exercised them over the years, over the last 70 odd years? Right up to the 1990s, when the economic reforms really opened up India and Indian genius, as it were, for innovation and economic, for entrepreneurship and so on, which is when the GDP, took a, rocketed really to now become a nearly a $3 trillion economy in price parity terms. But nevertheless, it's a very large economy and perhaps one of the 2 or 3 major economies of the world in other next 30 odd years, along with the United States and China, will be the 3rd biggest economy. And right now we are, with the Chinese population going down, we might become the 2nd largest market very soon. And so this is the kind of placement that India enjoys, that unfortunately our government and our policymakers did not foresee in terms of cultivating the leverages that India had and that we perhaps would have better prepared for. Now, India's policies have always been, because of our weaknesses, our economic and other, shall we say, shortfalls, we always thought of India as riding the coattails of one or the other superpower during the Cold War. And now that in the new millennium we have, and during the Cold War, we started out being pro-West. Then in the aftermath of the '62 war with China, we sought American help and Western help, and we were helped, but that help was limited. And we then got on to, shall we say, the Russian coattails, the Soviet Union's coattails, because they were freer with their technology, with the military hardware and so on, but they were not a strong economic power. That was always a limitation on how much the Soviet Union would help us further our interests economically. With the end of the Cold War, the options opened up, and you had the Narasimha Rao government then deciding, well, if China could ride America's coattails to prosperity, India could do the same. And that's where the reforms happened. And in the new century, in the last decade or more, we have signed the foundational accords with the United States in trying to help, shall we say, ring fence China and its ambitions, because that's the common threat that's perceived by most of our the states friendly to India, as does India, and it's in our interest, therefore, to cultivate these countries. But that said, the question isn't India too large and big to be a free rider on security? Because we have been free riders on security provided by the Soviet Union during the 70s, right up to the 1990s. And thereafter, we have been, in a sense, free riding on the security afforded by the United States and its military presence in Asia. Can this be a permanent solution for our problems? I suggest it is not. That we have to be the great rimland power that Speakman envisaged for India. True, it was in India that was much larger than the present day India, but we haven't lost our strategic location. We haven't lost our resources. Our population is amongst the largest assets that anywhere, any country could boast of. And with the kind of technological competence we are showing, we have, in fact, as it say, we have several of these leverages with us. But continuing to ride the American bandwagon may be to, in a sense, restrict our options, to restrict our choices, strategic choices that we make. Because, mind you, there was a non-alignment that in Nehru's days that has, in a sense, been calibrated into what has been called strategic autonomy in the new century. It basically is the same thing that you're acting as a balancer, which is fine if you can manage it without tilting too much to one side or the other. In the new millennium, then when you talk about something like the quadrilateral, in which India was conceived as one of the four pillars, Australia, Japan, Australia, and the United States being the three other pillars, along with India, to form the quadrilateral. And then we have India has joined various other multilateral organizations and arrangements like the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, to name a few. The BRICS, that's the condominium of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, BRICS. And my geopolitical thinking, and that's how I'm in the school of realist power politics, wherein you look at your self-interest to cultivate leverages to, shall we say, to work against the adversary that you face. That's the basic notion of realist geopolitics. That's the school I belong to, and that's those are the kind of principles I've sought to apply to India's situation. In the 21st century, as India becomes more powerful, not less, when India's the demographic dividend begins to pay in terms of a very much more skilled workforce, etc., which is still work in a sense, it's a work in being, as it were. We haven't realized that status yet. We are a bit slow there. It is something that the Chinese very quickly got on to and capitalized on. And they have, within 2 generations, actually become a first world power in terms of per capita income. We are there now in the bracket of first world powers, while we unfortunately still meander in a second tier status amongst world powers. But hopefully that will improve. And my view is that if we follow the correct geopolitical paradigm and geostrategic paradigm, we'll reach it if all the other things improve as well in other sectors. The architecture that I have propounded over the years, I did this first in 1994, using Speakman's basic rimland notion, was to have an Indian architecture, security architecture, anchored at the 2 ends in Israel and Japan. This was in 1994 in my first book, and made up with a coalition, a security coalition that included the Southeast Asian countries. As a hedge against China that I foresaw would be the principal adversary that India has to tackle, has to be concerned with, the competitor rival, economic competitor and a strategic rival that we have to be concerned about and that we would have to, in some sense, neutralize. And here, I think that particular architecture that I is what I draw on when I talk of an evolution of that architecture into something I articulated in my last book, Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition, when I talked about, there's the quadrilateral that's there in place. I have said modify it. And I called it the modified, quadrilateral, or mod quad in short, wherein the US is replaced by a group of Southeast Asian countries. Similarly, I talked of BRICS as a loose security coalition without China. So you develop BRICS, as in Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, as a loose security coalition. Now, why am I a little skeptical about the US playing its role? It's a pointed role, as it were, in not just the quadrilateral, but in AUKUS that the Biden administration has more recently conceived of. AUKUS being Australia, UK, and US. Where there's the Anglo-Saxon angle to it, they perhaps get along better, they speak the same language and have the same sort of interests. And this is, in a sense, a leftover from the colonial imperial times, and that perhaps does have a play here. And that also, in a sense, is the reason why I differentiate the US interests from the interests of the other Asian states, which are outside the pale of the quadrilateral, but very much part of India's concerns in Asia, in terms of trying to get together these states to form a grouping that will, shall we say, begin to hedge and is successful in hedging China's options and in trying to contain its ambitions, expansive ambitions. Look at the basic reason why I'm a little doubtful about the US's credentials as a central pillar of the quadrilateral is Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is, of course, formally not a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but it had done everything bar join Ukraine formally. Now, if the US is able to distance itself when a member state or a near member state faces an existential threat and is willing to do everything short of actually committing itself militarily to protect one of its members, as the Article 5 in NATO Charter requires you to do, then you are essentially seeking an escape hatch from your commitments, which is the point I've been making for the last 25 odd years, because the US, in its own national interest, will not always come to a coalition partner's aid or assistance if it doesn't serve its purposes. Now, it's all very well for the Biden administration to impose sanctions, etc., on Russia and Belarus that the US claims is centrally helping the Russians, go into and invade Ukraine and establish a toehold there. But the problem is this, that if the US cannot be relied on by Ukraine, by a NATO quasi-UTMM, almost NATO member, to pull its chestnuts out of the fire in facing down an existential threat posed by Russia, can any Asian state that, all the Asian states are partners in one way or the other with the Americans, rely on America to come to our aid should the balloon go up vis-a-vis a conflict or confrontation with China? And that's the real conundrum here. How much do you rely on the United States to come to your aid, no matter how many foundational accords you sign, no matter what the level of convergence is in trade and economic interests, etc., etc. The fact is the US interest, will it ever be fully engaged in terms of militarily joining Asian states should the Chinese begin throwing their weight around? And here the immediate threat that I see and an example of the problem the US faces is Taiwan. Taiwan was a treaty partner, alliance partner. But as soon as China came along, the Washington establishment decided, well, we can get more with China, and let's just abandon Taiwan, leave it to its own devices, as it were, which is, by the way, exactly what is done. No matter what the 1979, there is some kind of commitment there, but it's well short of an alliance commitment. And the White House, both in Trump's time, earlier in George W. Bush Jr.'s time, and now in Biden's tenure, has made quite clear that it is just a partner of, well, not so much, it's a partner when the US needs it, but it may not be central. Taiwan may not be central to US's concerns, regional concerns, in terms of fighting the Chinese. Should it invade Taiwan? There's still a lot of hedging there by Washington. And this is the kind of dilemma faced by Japan and South Korea, and more centrally now by Taiwan, because the Chinese have claims on the Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu Islands that they call them, in the East Sea, which are Japanese, but the Chinese claim them, just as they claim all of the South China Sea and the islands that they've created out of cement and coral mid-channel. And they now say this is ours because of some 9-dash line that they create a history for in terms of giving it legitimacy. This is the kind of thing that the Chinese have done. This is what you can expect from China in the future, that they expect, in a sense, to realize fully the notion of the Chinese imperium at its apex. And that was some time back. In fact, they claim all kinds of historical reasons why they'll end up owning all of Asia. Because from the 11th to the 15th to 16th centuries, or 17th centuries, until the British came on the scene, and earlier the Dutch in the East Indies, the Chinese, the Asian states that were bordering China, by way of politeness, used to send, go to the Chinese court, and were then deemed to be tributary states, who had to pay tribute to the Yellow Emperor. And this is the kind of mindset, in some sense, that still informs Beijing's policies. Shankar Menon, of course, is a sinologist of repute, and he may have a lot more to say and more expert views on it. But the problem is, any country that deals with China, at least in Asia, is treated as a virtual tributary state. It's the superior-inferior kind of division the Chinese make clear is the basis for the interactions with Asian states. So India can't possibly countenance this sort of thing, but we end up, in a sense, really by our actions and by not using our many leverages and not following realpolitik policies of the kind that China does effortlessly and has done so. We have, in a sense, pinned ourselves down to our inhibitions. And we have a whole bunch of inhibitions, not just the moral and so on. We tend to think that we are a more moral nation than others, etc., etc. This is kind of a carryover from the Gandhian notions of non-violence and God knows what, which are completely counterproductive to our national interests in terms of furthering national interests. And this is not where India is or should be. And this is why I think the kind of rhetoric needs to be re-engineered for the modern world, where it's a dog-eat-dog world, where the real thing is, how do you deal with a China that has no scruples? Because we think of ourselves as a country with great many scruples. We'll not do this, we'll not do that, we'll be a responsible power, we'll be a non-proliferator of nuclear and WMD technologies, we hinder ourselves. Nobody hinders us. We voluntarily join all kinds of non-proliferation regimes and therefore end up restricting our choices. For instance, the Chinese had no compunction in transferring nuclear missiles, nuclear weapons and missiles and technologies for both of them to Pakistan in order to tie India down to the subcontinent, to South Asia, to force India to be preoccupied with Pakistan. They did so. So they think very strategically. And they started doing that, by the way, after seeking permission, as it were, with the United States. And Washington, the United States, that is now seeking, that is supposedly our great strategic partner, was party to China's proliferating in a very single-minded, cold-blooded fashion the nuclear and missile technologies to Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, I have no problem with Pakistan acquiring nuclear weapons and missiles, but I do have a problem with China proliferating them to Pakistan, because it shows the kind of adversary you're dealing with in terms of lack of scruples, a lack of any kind of responsible behavior. Now, when India begins, the Indian government begins to act responsibly when you're dealing with China, which does not behave responsibly, and in fact makes advantages itself all the time by getting around laws and regulations and international controls and global, shall we say, restrictions and bans and so on, and sanctions, just so it furthers its own interests, then we have a problem. And that's the problem we are facing. Pakistan is not now, has never been, can never be a credible threat to India. China is now, has always been, and will always be the premier threat that India faces. The danger it poses India is real, and we have seen it since 2017 in Doklam, and since 2019 and 2020 in Eastern Ladakh. They claim all of Arunachal Pradesh. They call it Southern Tibet. I mean, who is to say that they're going to negotiate? And they have now said they will not negotiate something that Zhou Enlai had offered way back in 1953 to Nehru, the exchange of territories, Aksai Chin for the McMahon Line recognition by China. That's out the window now, because the Chinese say we do not accept it anymore. And they have new laws and new regulations and new, shall we say, principles that we abide by, meaning we accept their terms of reference, we accept their terms for negotiating a solution. How is this good for India? Now, that's why I have been suggesting what I call the Mod Quad and BRIS and other mini-laterals that I call, either with 2 or 3 other countries or just bilateral agreements, which can be smaller, looser security coalitions, keeping in mind one basic principle, that no other country will put its neck out for any other country. No other country. But it can facilitate your military, shall we say, ventures in trying to defeat your prime adversary. Thus, for instance, Indonesia has offered us a base to develop, but on the wrong side of the South China Sea. Now, we could, that's a beginning, but we should do more. We should, I've said, we should use the jujutsu principle against the Chinese. They have created these mid-channel islands, the synthetic islands in the South China Sea. Now, why don't we use what they've created? They think it's to their advantage. But why can't we use the situation they have created against them by, for instance, and I've said this, strategically arming all the countries on either side of these islands to narrow the seas for China. This is the thing, the idea I've put forward and detailed in my last book. And this is in the larger picture of trying to do a tit for tat for China's nuclear and missile proliferation to Pakistan, because they have set the precedent. We can refer to the precedent that China has set to then proliferate unbidden, open-endedly, nuclear weapons, whatever we have, to Vietnam, to ASEAN states, the other states in South China Sea who feel existential by China, like Philippines. Now we have, after 30 years, 20 odd years, I first brought it up, I remember, in the National Security Council meeting with the Foreign Office, then Foreign Secretary, and I won't name him, Shankar's predecessor at the time, who told me when I asked him in a plenary why it is that the ME had not considered the option of proliferating, transferring strategic weapons and armaments to Southeast Asian countries bordering on the South China Sea as a reciprocating action for China's first nuclear missile arming Pakistan. And I remember the words still now, it's etched with acid in my brains. He said it was not practicable. Not practicable. And unfortunately, then K. Subramaniam, who was in the chair before I could launch into the Foreign Secretary, and I had done enough to get on the wrong side of him, I think, as I have done with various other foreign secretaries, but not fortunately Shankar, Menon, or at least he's more Catholic than his predecessors were. How does practicability come into this situation when there is a sovereign decision to make, to hamper and hinder an adversary who has proven his bad faith, who has made it very clear that it wants India either on its knees, because it will never accept it as an equal. It has said so. It says so openly in every forum, international forum. Therefore, I think we should have no inhibitions whatsoever. Behave responsibly vis-a-vis nations that behave responsibly towards you. But you have no obligation to behave responsibly towards a country that does not behave responsibly towards you in particular. I don't much care whether China behaves responsibly in vis-a-vis other countries or towards the international system. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, it shows the same lack of scruples in every other sphere. It sort of exploits shall we say, the loopholes in the GATT system or the WTO system. How is it still a developing country? Why should it get concessions? But people are persuaded. Now, finally, and this is the question I've been raising in my books for 25 odd years, finally, someone like John Mearsheimer in University of Chicago, who is supposed to be a realist, now says, yes, we are responsible for creating the China threat that looms before the United States and the world. But that is no consolation. We should have been the first to point out to the world the problem that China has would become. But we didn't do so because we were too concerned, we were, shall we say, too conscious of our own weaknesses. China has never been conscious of its weaknesses. It has always maintained its interests as being topmost and something that they would achieve, no matter how long it takes them to achieve it, and using any means at their disposal. While we have been inhibited by a whole bunch of things, and to compound our problems, we haven't been geopolitically very, shall we say, pointed in our policies. We have tried to be part of a combine of countries that may not work out, as I pointed out, for the reasons I pointed out, if the central pillar is the United States. And therefore, I am for making common cause with other Asian states in similar circumstances, not an extraterritorial power that's 5,000 miles away, and who can then disengage at will. As Taiwan is realizing, as South Korea is realizing, as Japan is realizing, the reason why all these countries, including Taiwan, whose nuclear programs were literally capped by forcibly capped by the United States, are now wanting nuclear weapons. Consider this: if Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons, would there be a Ukraine crisis now? I remember writing at that time, Ukraine, you're foolish to give up your nuclear weapons as part of the demilitarization. Don't give up your nuclear weapons, because that's the only means of absolute security you have, not just vis-a-vis the Russians that you may fear for whatever reasons, but also against other comers who might try to discomfit you strategically. Anyway, the point is, South Korea now had a poll recently that some of you might be aware, where the bulk of the population says, yes, we should acquire nuclear weapons. Japan is 10 days to 15 days away from acquiring nuclear weapons. It's a virtual nuclear weapons power. Taiwan, I'm given to understand, is not very far behind. That they'll have to make up their minds, and I think we should do everything in our power to encourage them to become nuclear powers. Because so many nuclear powers on China's periphery is going to really get Beijing to rethink their policies. And this, curiously, is something that Homi Bhabha, who was chairing the first Atoms for Peace conference in 1955 in Geneva, wrote in a secret telegram to Nehru. He said, a chain of nuclear weapons states in Asia will make for stability. He did not refer to China at the time, but it was very, very prophetic when he talked about a ring of thermonuclear Asian states or nuclear weapon owning Asian states to bring stability to Asia, peace and stability. It may be armed stability, or it's stability and security and peace. It's not for any reason that you can have genuine prosperity, genuine peace, only when nations, all nations feel secure, are in a position to, shall we say, enforce that security, that stability. That's why I do not begrudge the Pakistanis they're acquiring nuclear weapons. Not at all. Because they're not a threat to India. And I have argued that we should try, the other geopolitical aim we should have is to, in some sense, realize the strategic unitarianness of the subcontinent that we lost with the partition in 1947. That will require us to be far more generous than we have been with Pakistan. We will just have to, and I've said, this may be far-reaching, but I said it in 2004 in my tome, Nuclear Weapons and Indian Security. I said that we have to do some forward thinking in terms of, for instance, withdrawing unilaterally all nuclear warheaded short-range and medium-range missiles from the western border with Pakistan. Unilaterally do so. Why? Because you lose nothing. You have long-range missiles that can reach any Pakistani target from hinterland locations. You lose nothing, but you reassure the Pakistanis. The other thing I've said we can do, this part of geopolitical thinking that we really have to begin to ingest and begin to incorporate into our policies. The other thing is, what is the thing that the Pakistan army fears most? It's not the parties and the politicians, the political establishment. They are for peace with India. It's the Pakistan army. What does it fear most? It's the 3 strike corps that you built up for no reason that I can, legitimately think of. Why? Because the 3 strike corps were set up after the Bangladesh war, when we succeeded in literally running a knife through Pakistan and partitioning Pakistan, right? We got our Bangladesh. And then we suddenly realized that the rump state that remained of Pakistan was our main threat. I mean, it boggles my mind that the government of India, that's filled with very bright people, can be so, what's the word? I mean, I can't begin to be nice about it, so I won't say anything more. But this is how our military policies, our security thinking, our other policies have gone haywire. And if you are unable to perceive threats properly, what else are you able to do right? I mean, the basic threat perception is wrong. You don't consider China, which tells you it's a threat, which does everything. It walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. But no, it is something else. It's a pigeon for us. It's a dove, a peace dove. While a nothing country of no consequence, whose GDP, Pakistan's total, GDP is 1/13, maybe now it's 1/14 the size of the market cap of the Mumbai Stock Exchange. That's a threat. That country is a threat. You can remove everybody and put Rajasthan police on the border and they will not do anything to offer India a casus belli that will finish off Pakistan. They need nuclear weapons, but we don't need to threaten them with nuclear weapons, for God's sake. They are in an existentially problematic situation. We are not, but we are with China, which we are not recognizing. So, short point, and I'll end here because I've taken up enough time. Sorry, Shankar, for getting into your question and answer session. But I think we have to begin to be more realistic, more far-seeing, and it's not something that very bright people in government don't, in their private moments, don't see the truth about. It's just that somehow or the other, we have gotten into a situation where we are prisoners of our own, shall we say, our own prejudices in many respects. Pakistan is more a problem of our prejudice, not a strategic concern or even less a threat. I thank you very much, Shankar. And thank you, everybody in the Asiatic Society of Mumbai for affording me this occasion to put forward my views.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you for that really wonderful exposition of India's, not just India's security concerns, but placing it in a geopolitical context. You've really given us a masterclass in how to think geopolitically and apply it to concrete situations. And that really, it was a real privilege listening to that. May I just remind everyone that if you have questions, either raise your hand or just put them in the chat box, because we'll come to them. It's very hard to comment on something that is so clear, but also in many ways very profound. It has so many implications. Also, partly because, it's not that I agree with Bharat on every tactical issue. I think there's a whole host of issues on which we probably differ, but basically I have found myself in agreement with him for several decades on the fundamentals. Pakistan is a strategic distraction for India. There is no question. This is not the real adversary. Frankly, you are judged by the adversaries you pick. And if you pick Pakistan as your adversary, that's what you're going to end up like. China has always been our main strategic focus, but it took, I think, the government of India and the political class in India a very long time. It's only until, I would say, the mid-noughts, sometime around 2004, 5, 6 maybe, that this idea started entering when, for the first time, the army was told in 2008, that they should prepare for a two-front war, and that Pakistan was a subset of the China problem, really, from our point of view. The problem is that for us in India, at least, and not for clear-headed realists like Bharat, but Pakistan is the adversary we're comfortable with. It's like the US and Russia. Russia today is the adversary the US is comfortable with. China is the adversary that neither of us not just comfortable, we don't know how to deal with, quite frankly. And you see this in the Ukraine crisis. I mean, Russia, in terms of economy, in every respect, is no match for the US. Even the Soviet Union was a much weaker adversary. But today, Russia under Putin, no matter what you say about how he's rebuilt it, is basically an exporter of commodities and energy. And what she is doing is trying to secure her own immediate periphery. And the US doesn't even have to commit her own troops to this. Just the threat of NATO membership is enough to engage Putin and actually to create a situation which can hurt Russia, fundamentally hurt her economy. Probably you can see signs of unrest within Russian society itself. But as Bharat just reminded us, what we are actually seeing here in geopolitical terms is much larger. We have watched for several decades as the Eurasian heartland is consolidated under new auspices. The more Western US pressure there is on Russia and on Iran, the more they are forced into Chinese arms. So for China, for the first time in her history, she is comfortable on land. Otherwise, she has always been preoccupied by her land borders, by the threat from the barbarians, the nomads, etc. Today, she's pushing at an open door when she does Belt and Road and builds railroads, fiber optic cables, trades, etc., across the Eurasian heartland. And she is consolidating a Eurasian heartland order under her auspices. If she faces resistance in seeking primacy, it is only in the maritime space around her. And that is the space that Bharat rightly identifies, has identified since 1994 as a space in which we need to actually organize or constrain China's behavior. The US is the primary maritime power, but the US has mixed interests. She has global interests. If she decides that Russia is her main adversary, she will try her best to separate China and woo China. And you have seen, as he said, in the case of Taiwan, in other cases, that the US commitments depend on the US interest at that particular moment. And even Trump, who is regarded as having been very harsh on China, he was the one who actually was willing to trade Taiwan for a good business deal with China. If you look at the first 2 years of the Trump administration, he was always willing to trade, to do a deal. So for him, there was nothing sacrosanct in this relationship. So it seems to me that he has the fundamentals right in his approach to what he's a patriot who sees things clearly, has foreseen things very clearly. The nuclear issue is another one where, as he reminded us, after what happened to Libya, who gave up their nuclear weapons, what happened to Saddam Hussein, who claimed to have weapons that he never had, what's happened to Ukraine now, anybody who's given up their weapons. Whereas you contrast that with Kim Jong-un, who has weapons, has demonstrated them, has shown the ability to deliver them, and is now independent of his mentors in China, and actually got the US president to come and talk to him, and has hardened his state to the point where he doesn't have to fear being absorbed by South Korea yet. He's absolutely right. There are a whole host of states, therefore. If you look at Northeast Asia today, North Korea has nuclear weapons. Over 66% of South Koreans, when asked, say, if North Korea has weapons, nuclear weapons, we must have them. China has nuclear weapons. Russia has nuclear weapons. The US has nuclear weapons and has troops in South Korea. How long can South Korea rely on the US extended deterrence? Will the US risk San Francisco, New York for sale? No. I mean, why would they? So, and if South Korea too goes nuclear, then how can Japan then be the only one, or Taiwan? So it seems to me that this what he describes as proliferation is really, in a sense, built into the geopolitical logic of Southeast and Northeast Asia, but mostly Northeast Asia. but it will spread. So why aren't we doing something about it? I think part of it is we were constrained in various ways. I've seen a lot of commentary, for instance, saying, oh, finally we're selling BrahMos. Why didn't we sell it before when we were asked? Frankly, the Russians were not willing to let us sell it. I know this from personal experience in the North. They weren't even willing to let us extend the range of the BrahMos. We were capable of doing it ourselves, but they wouldn't let us sell it to anybody else at that time. They were playing their own games, and they had other reasons. And you can't blame them, because they did provide sensitive parts of the BrahMos, and they didn't want it in other people's hands. But those situations have changed now. And I think we need to look at it at this new situation that Bharat has just described. Why are the Russians today willing to let you sell it to the Philippines and the others? They want to shake the world order now, in a sense that they didn't maybe 15 years ago. Today, they and the Chinese want to shake the Western world order in a fundamental way. And they see this as part of that. So they'll say, yes, please go ahead and do these things. And so I think there is space in today's world for India to take a much more activist view. On Ukraine, for instance, it would have done your credibility and made a lot of sense for you to call what happened on February 24th what it was, a Russian invasion and an expansion of the proxy war, which had been going on for a long time. But to say that name calling and so on is not a solution, nor is an invasion a solution to the problem of creating mutual and equal security, of building a new European security order. And we should have said, we're ready to help you build one if you want. If you're interested, we're ready to play a role. We could be much more activist and forward-looking without having to choose sides. Why do we have to choose sides? This is India. This is not some small little country which is dependent on other people for its security. Did somebody else fight for you when the Chinese moved into Ladakh? No. So at core, I think what Bharat's arguments on and this realist approach actually makes a lot of sense and leads to sensible policy. We can differ on the tactics, whether this is the time to do it, whether you can trust somebody with your technologies, who is the best allies. But basically, I think what he's arguing for, a forward-leaning, realist Indian approach to its own neighborhood, because our extended neighborhood is not just the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region, but also Southeast Asia and the maritime space around China. I think that is essential that we do that and we regain some initiative there. So thank you, Bharat. Thank you for a really good, I see a good and really a masterclass. I don't think there's another word for this. I see lots of questions both in the chat box and I see raised hands, but let me start with the chat box because I think that was really the first. I presume that's Kartikeya Gupta, who asks two questions. He asked me to read them out to you. How crucial to India is the involvement of European states in ensuring the stability of the Indo-Pacific region, with France as a Indo-Pacific resident power? Should India form minilaterals in the Indian Ocean with European nations, Southeast Asian states like Vietnam? Will European involvement give us a base on the right side of the South China Sea? Secondly, will India's development of anti-missile defense systems undermine nuclear deterrence in Asia?
Let me take the last issue first. I think anti-missile defenses are basically useless. It's a waste of money. There's a latest study done in America wherein they've been proven to be so manifestly useless that, I mean, none of the Patriot 3s and the rest of the systems that everybody is peddling, and I think Patriot 3 was peddled to us, as was Arrow 2, etc., but we stuck to our guns and we produced our own useless thing. So it's a good thing. I mean, by way of technology demonstration is what I thought we should have done. We should have stopped at the technology demonstrator stage simply because the physics is against anti-missile defenses. The physics is against it, not the technology that you can so far muster. It's just that the physics is against it. And unless you develop technologies that provide terminal speeds of over 7 miles per second, you will not be able to defeat you'll not be able to defend against the incoming missiles. Very simple. So we have wasted our monies, fine. It is good by way of technology development, whatever we have done with our two-stage, systems, etc., Prithvi systems. Okay, but these are more for show, and even the S-400, basically that everybody is jumping up and down about, is a very good anti-aircraft system, not an anti-missile system, though it may, if luck would have it, hit a missile, but then anything, if luck is on your side, all good things happen. But no. So anti-ballistic missile defenses are really are not workable in a real sense, and are a waste of money, and particularly a drain on resources where a resource-scarce country like India is concerned at this stage in its development. When we become like the United States and have a lot of money to burn, we should go ahead and have extraterrestrial defenses, etc. That, by the way, China is now building in terms of space stations to kill missiles. Now, this is something, if you really are serious, you have a better chance of being able to do. And that's why you ought to begin thinking ahead in terms of technology trends. If you have a space station, many of the physical limitations of hitting a missile or missile, are precluded. So you can work those technology. I mean, your dependence on luck diminishes and hit probability rises in a very physical sense. So these are the kinds of things you should go into, not get bogged down in these anti-missile defense systems, and where there are a lot of vested interests in the DRDO and so on. Maybe not right now, but I don't know. That and so the project got financed wrongly, in my words. And so it's really, we should go into building up of missiles, the whole arsenal panoply of missiles, because there is no defense against missiles. Long range, short range. There might be defense against cruise missiles, which are more likely to come in terms of being fielded than you would have a ballistic missile defense that is really credible, that can be fielded in the near future, or even medium range future. As to the in some sense, partnering European countries, yes, look, French have their bases in Port Huron, in Djibouti, in Ascension Island. Isn't that the thing?
Reunion.
Yeah. Reunion. Sorry. Yes. Reunion. I was remembering Seychelles and the problems we had there in Ascension. But the thing is that, yes, I think it will be useful for us to have partner these countries just to be able to use these assets. Not that the French will be able to come to aid, nothing. Just so our ships go there, replenish, we can have prepositioned stores, military stores, etc. That's the option that's afforded us when we partner, say, France or some of the European country that has actual physical bases in the Indian Ocean basin. But that said, it shouldn't really preclude us from building our own bases. The North and South Agalega Islands in Mauritius. We really ought to get on with it. I believe we are, but speed it up a bit, because we really need to place a squadron of Sukhois there, a warship, a flotilla there permanently on station. Similarly, why did we not use Vietnam's offer at one time of a central coastline port of Nha Trang for our base? I mean, that should have been the kind of in-your-face, Chinese face kind of action that would have really woken up the Chinese. Had we placed an aircraft carrier there, aircraft carrier, why not? The whole idea is to be in your face, be provocative, and let's see how the Chinese react. Because when you have, say, the nuclear armed states on China's periphery, We have an aircraft carrier in Natra. We have bases all over, even if it is access to bases like the French bases in Djibouti, because Chinese are also in Djibouti. So we are right there. And we have Chabahar. We really have to keep our contacts intact with Iran for the Chabahar access. And we should have, then we have Trincomalee. Now the Rajpaksa government has suddenly woken up to the utility of having India on board and not going fully over to the Chinese. We have Trincomalee, which Admiral Nelson called the finest deep water harbor in Asia. So we have that. Now build on it. Build on whatever the Indonesians are offering, even on the wrong side of South China Sea. Build it up so they see it as a good faith thing, that we believe in helping them with their security. Help them train their navy, help them train their armed forces, help Philippines train, help them train on submarines and so on. Give them our assets. Give them at friendship prices the Tejas combat aircraft. Surely we can do all these things and also help our own industry at the same time, which means bringing in the separate thing, which may be subject for another lecture by someone else. But the point, I think, is we have to begin to use the defense industry as both the cutting edge of technology and as increasing our diplomatic and geopolitical reach into Asia and points farther afield. And I think this is the kind of thing we should do. We have the South Agalega and Ascension Island of Seychelles. We have, in northern Mozambique, they offered us, as Shankar would validate by saying so, northern base on North Mozambican coast. That would have been wonderful. We didn't pick up on it. They asked the Indian Navy to found their Navy, and we did not take up on. I mean, how wretched can we be in missing opportunities? It cannot just be bad luck. I mean, these are choices. The choices we made, wrong choices we made. So yes, I think any help, assistance, partnering in a substantive kind is necessary. France is small enough that it cannot act as the US would, because you can't ask, you go to Diego Garcia on their terms, but you go to Port Huron on our terms. That's the difference.
Usha, Vijayalakshmi.
Yeah, I want to ask you, do you think that nuclearizing Southeast Asia will be able to neutralize a competitive rival? And then what happens if China reciprocates this compliment and then starts nuclearizing South Asia? Then will our relationship with, say, Sri Lanka or Maldives or Bangladesh be the same? A lot of nuclear warheads in our neighborhood. So we have one neighbor and we are having so much headache. Then this is really going to be serious if you have too many headaches.
Yes, Dr. Vijay Lakshmi, I quite appreciate your concern. But the problem is that we have, in a sense, created enmities. We have not pacified our neighbors in the way we should have. It is our fault that the Chinese are exploiting the opportunities we have provided them because of our own cussed policies, if I may say so. So our neighboring states are not to fault for what's transpired. An unpacified neighborhood, which is to pacify a neighborhood, having a pacified neighborhood, neighbors at peace with you, who are connected with you economically, culturally, and otherwise, is an asset and the first step towards India achieving great power status. Without that, you are right. That's precisely the sort of thing the Chinese should exploit. But if we are generous in our policies vis-a-vis our state, vis-a-vis our neighbors, why would they want nuclear weapons? So the disincentive is built into our generosity schemes where we to implement them. And the other thing I think is, if some Rajpaksa or some other government is determined on having nuclear weapons to thwart Indian design, whatever it is, then I think there are ways of stopping them from having them. We have the options to exercise. I'm sorry to say, but this is cold-blooded Chanakyan options that you can use. And we shouldn't in a sense, be inhibited from using. Yes, China, on the other hand, does not have the kind of choices that India has in trying to pacify our neighbors. China has Philippines, and you try dealing with a Duterte. It'd be wonderful if the Chinese deal with a Duterte who's nuclear armed. I'm all for it. It's what I've been saying. There's so many unpredictable things that China will have to, incorporate into the calculus, strategic calculus. Vietnam, the only country that has over 1,000 years, has waged a 1,000-year war with China and succeeded. The only country in the world that has beaten China militarily again and again over the last 1,000 years, which is what the Vietnamese are most proud about. And that's why when you have an enemy, an adversary that's much larger than you, more competent than you, more powerful than you, is what brings you up in the world. That's why Vietnam status is so prestigious. I mean, people, at least I am, awed by Vietnam. They have beaten America militarily. They've beaten the heck out of France, finished off their colonial ambitions or restoring of their colonial properties in Asia and so on. They finished off the Chinese in 1979. And then Deng Xiaoping did the right thing by then declaring victory and getting the hell out. Because they were being beaten by the irregulars before the regular Vietnamese army could come into the field. That's how good they are and motivated they are. I mean, we have to learn so much from these nations, really. We have very little to learn from the United States and the West, honestly speaking. In military terms, we have so much more to learn from Brazil and Argentina, from Vietnam in particular, than we have from everybody else. So yes, we have to do all these things, but not sequentially and not waiting for when India becomes the economic power, but now, with the resources we have.
Bharat, Dr. Prashant Kamble asks, so you said that China and not Pakistan was and will be the prime worry for our country, but in political spheres, often Pakistan is projected as a prime concern to worry about. What may be the reasons, benefits of these political spheres in giving this false projection? So how does the domestic politics of it play out?
Right. Well, as I sort of hinted at, we have, shall we say, externalized our Hindu-Muslim tensions at home, externalized it into the kind of foreign policy we have, anti-Pakistan stance in our foreign policy, where we badger Pakistan because we are unable to badger China, honestly. The point is, it's easy to beat up on a smaller power than to take on a big power, which is very confident of beating you up. So, right. It is comfort levels, as Shankar Menon mentioned earlier. You're comfortable with beating up on Pakistan. No, you're comfortable with Pakistan, having Pakistan as a threat, because you know you can beat it up anytime you want or deal with it in other ways anytime you want, in any which way you want. You do not have that liberty with China. And that's the point that we want. I've been advocating to get over the hump. We have to get over our prejudices, which is really the real problem vis-a-vis Pakistan. Because in practical terms, in realist terms, Pakistan is not, as I've said, a threat, can never be a threat. Because it doesn't have any of the metrics of a credible threat. It has nothing.
I have a long list of questions, so
okay, sure.
I think we'll have to move through.
Absolutely.
R.K. Narang had a question. Can you unmute yourself, or do we have to unmute you? I think we have to unmute you, perhaps. While we're waiting.
I have asked everyone to unmute.
But I don't think they can yet.
I will just try it out. Yeah.
In the meantime, let me ask you from the chat box. So why does Russia want Ukraine?
So this group captain Narang speaking?
That's Praful Rathod. Ah, yes. Okay, we've got, sorry, let's do that first. Yes.
Sir, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir. Sir, really understanding China should have been the first priority. But I think we should be focusing on what we need to do some of the suggestions, some of the issues you have raised over a period of time again and again. I think it is time for us to realize that in the past we got military and other technologies from the West, US, Europe, and Russia. This luxury is going to get over with China equating in technology in many of the military and other technologies. So as a result, India will have to strengthen its R&D ecosystem, military R&D ecosystem, as well as industrial R&D ecosystem. That should have been the area. We have to cut down on how foreign entities give us technology which we can do. That is
You
the
have a
area we should.
question? You have a question?
So I would like to ask his views on what should be the roadmap. If China in 1960 could fight superpowers, we have our adversary, which is going to become a superpower on our next door. What should be our approach to counter in a given times? Thank you.
Group captain, I think the thing is, I've always said, if you cannot beat your adversary, imitate him, emulate him. Do what China has done always in terms of technology development, and you reverse engineer. You start by reverse engineering and creating whole bureaus, design bureaus. We didn't do that because we were sticklers for the contract, wherein you said, oh, you can't do this, that, and that. Oh, right. That's the point about being responsible state. And by the way, many chiefs of services, chiefs of staff have said, oh, that's a very good thing to do. To be that we shouldn't reverse engineer, we shouldn't do anything that's ultra virus of the contract. I mean, it has left me dumbfounded, really, in talking to military leaders, of this type. China did not abide by any contractual obligations and letter of the contracts. They reverse engineered. That's how they built up the design bureaus. They're still not good at, say, developing and engineering an aircraft system, as you know, a power plant. That the jet engines are crap. That's why they still have to rely on the Russians to provide them. But the Russians have now wisened up to China and have put in design kings, as the Russians have told me, which makes it very difficult for them to reverse engineer. So that might be the problems we might face when we begin belatedly reverse engineering things. But then again, we have enough skills and competencies right now to rely on ourselves. But it'll require, Group Captain, for the government of India to go cold turkey on imports, really go cold turkey on imports. Use what China did and North Korea is doing, by the way. Just, I don't want to quote it as a big example of an exemplar of things that India should do, but it should use your nuclear overhang to develop your conventional military technologies, because you now have the latitude to say, look, we are unable to deal with you on the conventional military field, and therefore we'll have to go to the nuclear, whatever it costs. But that's, after all, the threat that China held out to the United States. And that's how we should do it with China, which is what I recommended in my last book. We have to go first use, nuclear first use in Eastern Ladakh, anywhere. We say, this is our line. If you transgress it, because we cannot compete with you, fight you on the conventional in the conventional battlefield with any possibility of success, we are going to go nuclear, and we are going to take out your wealth-producing eastern seaboard. That's the first thing we will do. We will not have decapitation strikes on Beijing. We'll want you leaders to think of what you have done. We are going to take out your eastern seaboard, in everything from Hong Kong on to the entire seaboard on the Eastern Sea. We take out there up to Harbin, and take out. What do you think that will do? Even with our 20 kiloton devices, weapons, even though we think we have the 250 kiloton and so on, which I really don't think we have, because the S1 test fizzled out in 1998. So we don't have a proven and tested thermonuclear weapon. But the 20 kiloton will do if we have enough Agni 5s that are triggered onto all the targets of Metro Shanghai, all the Fujian coastline, to take out their well-producing countries, and will reduce China, therefore, then to a virtually a third-rate power. Instantly. That's the prospect they have to face. Of course, we'll suffer too, but the whole point is we have an exchange ratio, and psychologically we have to use that exchange ratio. They are wealthier, they are more powerful. their wealth, their power will be reduced, not just minimally, absolutely, if there's a nuclear exchange. And that's what we have to work on. And we have to be bloody minded about it. I'm sorry, we cannot here be Gandhian and talk of non-violence, all that nonsense, because that completely destroys what credibility you have. So this is what will help, I think, Group Captain.
Praful Rathor's question: why does Russia want Ukraine?
Why does Russia want Ukraine? As I see it, the main reason Russia wants Ukraine are the approaches from the Black Sea. Because the approaches from the Black Sea, is the Russian underbelly, which is the weakest part, actually. And if you have a US maritime power, that's the US, and the Royal Navy and all these Western Navy that are very, very good at managing warfare on the seas, and you then have the Dardanelles choke point controlled by Turkey, a NATO member, what do you think the Russians are thinking? My God, not only do we have to have we have faced the entire North Atlantic, approaches, we have now to guard against the Black Sea approaches at the Dardanelles. It's an impossible thing. Then you have the Sea of Azov. Should you not control the Black Sea, you then do not control the Sea of Azov. You have problems there. So you then are vulnerable from the weakest aspect territorially of your country. Territorially speaking, you are the most vulnerable from seaward side, from Black Sea side, rather than from landward, because Russia has enough land forces of considerable weight and technological superiority, etc. But the sea forces are what the problem is, because the 1997 partition agreement with Ukraine, obtained an impossible situation. You have the Ukrainian Navy and the Russian Navy sharing naval assets and infrastructure in Sevastopol and Odessa. How is that going to work with maritime, the Navy, the NATO navies coming in and using the Ukrainian assets? There's no such thing as Ukrainian assets. They're common assets. So you see the point. Therefore, you appreciate why Putin so wanted Ukraine, at least not to be a formal member of NATO, wherein the NATO would be able then formally to use Sevastopol and Odessa and other naval ports and smaller harbors. So that, I think, to me, as a geostrategist, I would think that is the most vulnerable thing I would wish to defend against. And as a third directorate and fifth directorate counterintelligence man, Putin would have thought of that, because otherwise we can handle the approaches from Archangel on down to the North Atlantic, North Sea coast, but not this kind of problem that would be created by Ukraine, a NATO member, controlling the approaches to the Black Sea.
In fact, by all accounts, what the Russian army has achieved in the last 7 days is a land bridge to Crimea.
That's right. Exactly.
And in fact, beyond Crimea, across towards
That's right. They already own Crimea. That's
so
right.
It's exactly that coast that they are now controlling.
Precisely.
Alok Shivshankar, can you unmute yourself? I'll go to the chat box if I may. Isn't India doing, this is from Prashant Vishnupad, isn't India doing many of the things here? You're with us. Good. Alok, you want to?
Yeah, good. Thank you. There's, I think, a problem with the unmute. I have a question, Professor Karnad, which is, how do you balance economic security concerns or prosperity concerns with national security? Particularly at this stage, we are severely dependent on US and Chinese equity, capital, trade flows, and otherwise. So if we were, for geopolitical reasons, want to be independent of that, how do we balance the economic concerns, particularly over the short term?
Right. Look, I think we haven't used the access to our markets as leverage enough. Which other market in the world is solvent enough, has a kind of potential and prospects than the Indian market? Tell me. Is there any market outside of China? And China is a controlled market. You don't have access. You cannot go and set up a company in Shanghai and do as an American company or a European company can do in India, even with all the regulatory problems that we have. And that these are being eased now. So use your market access. You are in the driver's seat. Everybody wants to sell. Nobody wants to buy. So if you want to buy, you have the leverage, you have the upper hand. Use it. Use it in a substantial way, not to gain some small rinky-dink advantages here and there, which is what we have done, unfortunately. And I can go into a series of incidents, where our negotiations haven't been good enough. But the point made, our market is our extraordinary leverage, which we don't use. So that's no really hindrance to our doing what we need to do geopolitically, because that market access is what we can use very profitably for our own interests.
This is from Prashant Vishnupad. Isn't India doing many of the things you're suggesting? Like reorienting towards China as the main threat, arming Southeast Asian states, reorienting strike core towards China. Also, what is the harm in leveraging the US to strengthen Indian economy and military capabilities?
Well, there's nothing wrong if the Americans were forthcoming, but you had the DTTI, the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, that was initiated at the beginning of in 2012, I think, if I'm not wrong.
2012.
And, yes, 2012. And what has it gotten us in terms of substantial project collaboration? Trump actually closed down the collaboration that was agreed upon to develop jet engines here, which really the ultimate technology thing that most countries are loath to part with, that technology and the skills and the competencies to design and develop and manufacture high turbine jet engines for combat fighter planes. So if you're not going to get those kinds of technologies and you're being palmed off with F-16s, which is what they'd like you to buy, or the more harmless C-17s and the C-130 transport airlifters, then, how does it serve your purposes? Of course, we have been buying these things to placate them and pacify them, which I think the wrong thing to do. It's sending the wrong message that these guys are chumps who can be exploited forever. Because, you threaten them, technology or this, that, and the other, and you just fall in line and say, okay, we'll buy $3 billion of this, and they are quite happy. And then we end up, denuding our exchequer. So we have to be a little bit more careful and perhaps a bit wiser.
Ruby Maloney is asking, is Dr. Karnad suggesting a second look at ASEAN and SAARC?
Look, SAARC, absolutely. SAARC
I'll add RCEP to this.
I'm sorry?
I'll add RCEP to this.
RCEP, okay. Yeah, I mean, look, free trade is a wonderful thing in theory. Now, it can be used against you if you're not careful. And by and large, I think maybe we are good negotiators. Maybe Shankar Menon is better placed to answer this. I don't know in economic terms. I don't know because I think other ministries come in other than his own foreign ministry. And I don't know how good negotiators they are. But when I see the outcomes, there's something missing. And I find that, we have given away, we have conceded far more ground than we have obtained when dealing with other trading partners, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we can use all these things if we are good at it. If we are good hard negotiators that the Chinese are. Chinese always seem to get their way, no matter who they negotiate with. It might be some small Pacific island and they suddenly have an airbase there for next to nothing. Or they might be dealing with the United States and they end up still getting something, even though the United States may be fully aware of everything. And then, of course, the Chinese do not quail from intelligence operations, from acquiring technologies by hook or crook, usually by crook, which is not a bad thing, using the diaspora. I don't know what we do, but we have a tremendous diaspora in the technology sector. Things, but I don't know whether we are doing it or not. But this is the kind of thing we should do, and not, there's no bar on anything that a sovereign India can do. I think that's the one thing I've always said, that we inhibit ourselves, we restrict ourselves. There's no imposition of restrictions on us that we don't agree to.
There's a question again from Praful Rathore. How is it possible to remove China from BRICS to form BICS?
No.
Sorry, actually it's BRICS. As you
BRICS.
said, as Russia and China nowadays are so close to each other.
No, Russia and China, that's one of those big myths. Russia is as fearful of China as perhaps India is. And that's the reason why I believe Russia is very happy now for us to proliferate BrahMos missiles to all the South China Sea states that we want to, because they see that China needs to be contained even in their equation, even in their nexus, so that it's controllable, that the Chinese partner is manageable. They can manage China better when it is militarily hedged, it is ring-fenced. It is, and that's why Russia will always help India in, however surreptitiously otherwise, against China. And they'll never make common cause with China against India. They might make it against the United States. When the United States use into view, or West European state or whatever. But against India, they'll be far more, I think, apprehensive of helping China against India, because it will hurt their own interests in terms of Moscow trying, in some sense, situationally to control China. So I don't think we should fear the China-Russian nexus all that much, because it's not there. They are very much more fearful. They fear the Chinese takeover of Siberia, resources, Siberia, etc., etc. And we can use that for our purposes.
Alak Ray asks 3 questions, 2 of them linked. How come India has adopted such a low-key and somewhat inward-looking posture during the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I'm sorry.
Can everyone please mute the? Yeah. How come India has adopted such a low-key and somewhat inward-looking posture during the Russian invasion of Ukraine? How come now that our major weapon supplier, Russia, is so isolated, now very dependent on China? Is it not time to direct ourselves away from this relatively weak ally? And given India's own...
who is the weak ally? I'm sorry.
Russia.
Russia is the weak ally. Okay. I don't know.
Given India's own situation regarding the nuclear sector, is it practical, as you suggest, to think of even trying to export nuclear reactors, much less encourage other Southeast Asian, East Asian countries to acquire nuclear weapons?
I'm not sure where you've gotten this mythical notion that we are not advanced in nuclear reactors, for God's sake. My thing has been, my pet peeve has been that India has mastered 3 fuel cycles: uranium, thorium, and which the other? Plutonium. 3 entire fuel cycles have been mastered by India. We have a 700 megawatt breeder reactor that's going to be operational, hopefully not very far out into the future. Bhabha's plan, the great Homi Bhabha and visionary Homi Bhabha's plan for energy self-sufficiency, built on India's owning 1/3 of all thorium resources in the world. In the Travancore, the sands of Travancore are there. Kerala, Coromandel Coast, sands are all there for us to exploit, that he had hoped the Indian government would invest in. Unfortunately, that's the reason why I oppose the nuclear deal with America. It means being diverted from self-sufficiency with the 3-staged program that Bhabha had drawn up, by investing in French reactors, in American reactors, in Russian reactors, rather than our own reactors. Natural uranium that goes on to plutonium reactors that feed into each other. They produce the feedstock for the next tier of reactors. It's a wonderful interlinked program that Dr. Bhabha envisioned, but we are still far from realizing it. And I think the government of India has been insufficiently, shall we say, insufficient in its policing of the thorium sands, the monazite sands being taken away by unscrupulous smugglers and so on. And I think we need to tighten the screws there. But that said, we have all the resources and the capabilities in-house to not buy any multi-billion-dollar reactors, complexes of 10,000 megawatts. Yes, these are 10,000 megawatt reactors and so on and so forth. But you did not allow our program to grow and invest in them. Instead, you used it as leverage to get a nuclear deal that I always felt would hinder and hamper us and shackle us in many ways. So whatever the reasons for it, I don't want to get into that. The point being that, again, we have hindered our own natural capabilities and shackled them. And if we were to go full tilt on self-sufficiency, then I think we'll be able to realize it, because we have the design capability that we can upscale from the natural thorium to plutonium to breeder reactors and so on, and finally to thorium reactors. So it was thorium, plutonium, and uranium, the three fuel cycles that we can go on. So, and we should be able to sell these reactors to friendly states. Reactors, they need, everybody is energy deficient. Why should China sell Westinghouse reactors, that technology that they have reverse engineered? Now, again, they do this all the time. They buy the Shinkansen technology from Japan. They buy the Siemens signaling technologies for fast, super fast speed trains, and then sell it to the world. You know, and so this is the sort of thing we should do. We should emulate adversaries far more, because friends are not as useful as adversaries in terms of what to do, because they are successful in doing it. And China has been enormously successful, and we should really follow the Chinese example.
And this weak ally, Russia?
The weak ally, I don't think it's a weak ally at all. How is it a weak ally? I mean, right now, I mean, depending on how you see how the thing works out or pans out in Ukraine, if, let's take the ultimate thing and say Putin merely reabsorbs all of Ukraine, right? Let's take that. With Ukraine in Putin's pocket, that entire maritime thing is gone for NATO. From the southern flank is immediately firmed up. Because Turkey is not going to be a credible threat ever to a Russian navy that is in the Black Sea, completely, shall we say, able to work autonomously. So that's finished. Now you then work against the real problem that NATO has always had, which is extended deterrence. America has shown that its deterrence promises cannot be relied upon. They have shown it. And there's concern in European circles. Oh, look, the Americans, whatever the Article 5 of the Charter, NATO Charter, if they cannot be relied upon, and then the Ukraine thing reinforces that view, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to weaken NATO, which the isolationist sections of the American society would be very happy with. They have been saying so. People on the right wing with Tucker Carlson, all the other on Fox News, are actually saying, what is Ukraine? Let Russia have it. So the point, I think, is that Russia is not a weak ally. I think Shankar would bear me out. Russia is a very strong country. Yes, it's economically not as prosperous. Its GDP is less than India's right now. It is at 1.3 trillion in 2020, by 2020 reckoning, 2 years ago. We are at 2.67 trillion. So yes, but economically, therefore, we can help each other out. They can help us, and they have been forthcoming in technology terms. They have to be maybe compelled a bit more to, let us do what we want to do with the technology we buy from them, failing which to reverse engineer and do whatever we have to do, whatever we talk in contractual terms about Russia not allowing. They are nobody to allow this or not, or that, if we are determined to do what we have to do.
Captain Johan Banerjee, I hope I pronounced this right. Why can't this problem be seen from the paradigm of addressing the underlying suspicion and mistrust between India and China, thereby easing the environment, enhancing coexistence, and probably work towards a multipolar realignment of the global order? After all, philosophically, we are closer to our surrounding Asian countries compared to the Western ones.
Well, I would completely disagree with you there, because I think, as the sinologists everywhere would say, the Chinese really believe there cannot be two tigers on the same mountain. So no, the Chinese will not tolerate you as an equal or treat you as an equal. And there's no great convergence of cultural values and so on. So that is nonsense, in the real sense that even if there was some civilizational links from Fujian or something from 7th century, those are long gone and evaporated in the mist of time. What we really have is an India that, starting because of our colonial legacy, like it or not, we are structured on Western lines. So it's easier for us to deal with Western countries. We're able to speak their language, use their concepts. We are familiar with how they work things and so on. We should exploit that, which we don't do, but that's a separate matter. The point is that we are far more in sync and resonate better with the West for a reason. You cannot go back some 8 centuries and then say, oh, well, there were some civilizational links and then we are more in common with China. We have nothing in common with China. We have nothing in common with China. And not even in trade terms, because we are actually rivals and competitors in every realm. I don't see where we can cooperate and be mutually, in a mutually beneficial sense. So no, I completely, reject that thesis of yours that there's some kind of other links that we can, that will help us obviate the kind of confrontationist path the two countries are naturally on. It's nothing to do with, it's geopolitically, we are two strong countries on the same, the question is who plays chicken, in this, who is going to move out and let the other person have his way. That's what the problem really is.
We have literally 2 minutes left. But I have one last question, which I can't resist. What are the steps to realistically counter the growing radicalization problem in the subcontinent? How do we integrate the people of Bangladesh, Pakistan with the people of India? Because we're essentially the same people, and have a relationship like that between the US and Canada? And will it give India a chance to reclaim its areas, etc., of the Indus Valley?
Yeah. The wrongest thing for us to say is we are the same people.
You've threatened their identity.
Yeah, you threaten their identity. Absolutely. That's one thing we shouldn't do. And by the way, they're not the same people. Whatever we were in terms of, that kind of familiarity of 1947, and I'm married to a Punjabi, and I know what that means. There are the partition pathologies at work everywhere, and they go on and on. But that said, the point I think is that no, we are not the same people. We are different nations. And actually, Pakistan nation is a very distinct nation. And they've built an identity around it, rightly or wrongly, in the anti-India basis. That's fine. But what is our policy? Our foreign policy is also anti-Pakistan, isn't it? It's what I railed against earlier in my talk, that we are fixated on, the idée fixée is Pakistan, which in a military sense is really sub-zero, is really not even zero in terms of credibility as a threat. And yet you get worked up about Pakistan. And here's a maximal threat that you begin ignoring because of what? No reason at all, other than that you're cowed by China, other than you're fearful of China, other than that you're apprehensive of what China will do to you. When China can do nothing, if you respond in kind, they'll be able to do nothing. So Pakistan, Bangladesh are not the problems. You mind your own store in terms of, look, religion should be, if you want to get down to it, and it's not my field, and it's, but this is something that really is a hindrance in our foreign policy, as maybe Shankar Menon is better placed to talk about. When we talk of using religion in ways that are not conducive to our national interests, and I'm sorry to say, this externalization of the Hindu-Muslim tensions at home is the worst thing that you can do, because whatever we do here within our territorial limits nevertheless has spillover effects in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Pakistan, in Maldives, in Sri Lanka, all over. So yes, we have to be very careful that we do not let that run over the rim, as it were, and spoil our interests and our futures. And it's not a collective future. I'm talking about singularly Indian future, which is dependent on each of these countries being happy with India for their own reasons, not because we want them to be happy, but because we are generous and they see their interests and the larger benefits that they gain from being nice with and trading with India and having, coal run from Jharia coal fields into Karachi factory yards and so on and so forth. They see, rather than paying 10 times as much for coal from some New South Wales of Australia, which is ridiculous, but that's, if the Pakistanis want to do that, hey, feel free. But then they should have a reason. They shouldn't feel that they'll somehow be victimized if they did that. That is, run trains from Jharia into the Karachi ship, into their factories. We have to create the ecosystem, as the jargon goes. But this is precisely it. We need to do so many things and set our neighborhood right first. We talk about neighborhood first policy, but I'm sorry to say, it hasn't borne the fruit that one would have wished for.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you we've already run half an hour over time, but it's a tribute to you and to what you've said and how you've provoked us to think that I still have a host of questions waiting for you. But thank you very much for that. I'll hand this back to Meenal, I think, if I may.
Yes, it has been a long session. Thank you so much. So on behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, it is my privilege to thank the two distinguished speakers we have heard today. We are sincerely grateful to them. Professor Karnad, a renowned expert in national security, you are of course well placed to speak to us about the present and future dangers which face us in India and elsewhere. Your lecture has introduced us to the complex factors which influence national foreign policy. It has spelled out the multiple issues that confront India and the world in current times. These concern us all. Thank you for your incisive remarks and insights. It has been a presentation which will be and should be remembered a great learning experience, sir. Ambassador Menon, what can I add to the accolades you have received over many long years? It is no surprise that you are acknowledged to be a true master of the art and practice of diplomacy. Today, with your comments and your remarks, you have amply shown why you rightfully deserve all the praise you receive. I thank both the speakers for sharing their peerless insights that penetrate through the fog to give us a clearer perspective on how to see India's role in the future. While I have been steeped in literary theory as my academic background, I appreciate that you have woven a tale of intriguing alliances that makes for a riveting conversation. This has been a stimulating evening, and we are all beholden to you, Professor Karnad and Ambassador Menon. I thank the audience for their interest, their participation, and their searching questions. This has been a most enriching session. As always, our thanks to our Honorary Secretary, Dr. Usha Vijayalakshmi, for the technical support she continuously provides us for our online lectures. I thank you all. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Menon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.